251ers, do you even know how well that you're doing? We're in the last lecture for chapter 15. There's only 16 chapters in this course. This is very exciting news for you. I'm sad, because I like hanging out with you, even here in Galveston, where I'm recording another lecture. This one right here. Solo, again, sadly. But this is the last lecture for chapter 15, and then we're only going to have one more chapter to hang out. So please make sure you maximize your fun time hanging out, learning about what we're going to learn about is some other seafloor environments, mostly nearshore seafloor environments. So let's start out talking about something you've probably seen before, rocky seafloors, which includes things like kelp forests, right? Kelp, some species of kelp attached to rocks as deep as 30 meters. We talked about kelp. You saw pictures of kelp when we were talking about invasive species, and kelp are not invasive, but some other, something else was in the area, Caulerpa. Only large storm waves can break the kelp free because if this is a huge kelp reaching up into 30 meters is like, that's big, right? That's like 35 yards. Reaching up into the water column, it's held to the seafloor by something called a holdfast, right? And the reason that these leaves can go up into the water column like that is because they have gas inside of them, and so they float. They have gas-filled pneumatocysts to keep those blades floating upward, which allows them to grow upward, which is a good thing for them because they're plants, they're photosynthetic, so they need light, so they want to go towards the light. The kelp can also grow another 30 meters along the surface to allow for good exposure to sunlight, so it kind of goes up and out. And if you remember, we talked about one of the threats to kelp forests, or I guess maybe you can say one of their herbivores, because they're plants, are sea urchins, right? The little spiky animals. They look like little balls with spikes on them. And they basically eat the holdfast because they can't swim. They just walk around the ground. And they come to a holdfast and they're like, what's that? And then they eat it. And then if you break apart what's holding to the ground, whoosh, the rest of it just floats away. Did I just go in the wrong direction? Oh, you know what's awesome? The other awesome thing is this is actually the last slide in the lecture. So I'm going to go way backwards and then come back to this. That's okay. The places that we find kelp forests, they're anywhere you find rocky seashore. So all along the west coast, these are kelp with air bladders, and then there's some other types of kelp, shrub kelp, that you find more in colder areas. But in particular, along the rocky coast of the west coast, again, this is a tectonically active region, so they have rocky coasts instead of nice, big, smooth, sandy coasts. That is where you find kelp. So, and again, sea urchins, they're not bad. They're just doing what it is that they do. They're kept in check by otters. Now that we're not hunting otters anymore, they're kept in check by a healthy otter population. Let's go back to the beginning of this chapter. Remember that slide? Beginning of this lecture. What I want to tell you is about, this would have made more sense as an introduction to the rest of the lecture, is a continental shelf benthos. So we're going to talk about all things that live along the continental shelf. If you remember hydrothermal vents, they're in deep water. They don't live on the continental shelf. And we also talked about coral reefs, which I guess technically do live in the continental shelf, but this is basically all that stuff excluding coral reefs. So something you should know is that the amount of biomass that we find on the seafloor in general, right, and this is particularly or also true nearshore and continental shelves, the amount of biomass on the seafloor is directly proportional, directly related to surface chlorophyll distributions. More than 98% of the 250,000 known marine species live in or on the ocean floor. Benthic organisms live mainly on continental shelves. Right? 98% of the organisms that we know about, right? We're always discovering new ones, but the vast, vast, vast majority of organisms that we know, animals that we know, I should say, known marine species, this is animals, live in or on the ocean floor in general, right? So that's not just near the coast. But the highest biomass by far is near the coast. Benthic organisms live mainly on the continental shelves because that's where there's more food. And so if you look at this shading of how much biomass you find in benthic environments, this dark kind of fuchsia right there, that's the highest color. That indicates greater than 300 grams per meter squared. That's a lot. But we have 10 to 300 is most of what these coastal areas are, this kind of pinkish purple color. 0.1 to 10 is this blue color right here. So that's already 100-fold less biomass in these areas than in these areas, right? And then this is less than 0.1 in these areas, so potentially 1,000 or more times less biomass out here in benthic areas than we have in coastal areas. And again, the reason for that is because there's more food, more nutrients in coastal areas. You know this, some of that's because of upwelling, some of that's because of runoff from land. So there's more nutrients in the surface waters. More nutrients equals more phytoplankton. More phytoplankton fall to the floor eventually. And even though you've learned this from the biological pump, only 1% of that biomass makes it to the seafloor. That 1% can range in magnitude, several orders of magnitude. So most of the biomass is near shore on the continental shelves, and therefore most of the diversity also is. So, and another reason, by the way, that most of the species live in the oceanic floor, or on or in the ocean floor, again, is because there's 3D structure to it, and so there's places to hide in different niches, which you don't have as much of in the water column. Okay, so communities, apparently we're talking about rocky shores now. That's right, we spend most of the rest of the time talking about rocky shores. Things can live on or in the seafloor. Epifauna are animals that are attached to the substrate, like you find marine algae on the top of rocks, things like that, barnacles. Things that move over the seafloor also are considered epifauna that live on top of the seafloor but they crawl around, things like crabs and snails. These are epifauna. You know what? Let's say it wasn't a lie. It was more like a partial truth. We're back to this. Epifauna. Epi. Fauna means types of animals. Epi is living on top. And we find kind of a moderate diversity of these species. Greatest animal diversity is in the tropical latitudes, and the greatest algae diversity is in the mid-latitude. So it's interesting that they don't match up, because people for a long time thought that the tropical latitudes would always have the most diversity. Not always true. So the rocky intertidal zone is a really classic ecology, really, really, really good stuff. And it's because it's this 3D structure, and we have different places that animals can live that are experiencing different environments, right? There's some stuff that's all the way at the top where it's always dry, and then there's some stuff all the way at the bottom that's always wet, and then there's stuff in the middle that's beaten by waves and is sometimes wet and sometimes not wet. And so it's a lot of different types of lifestyles that it can support. So really, really interesting places. Rocky intertidal biomass is greater than 1,000 grams per per square meter. And if you remember, this is like 10,000 times more than you find in the next region, right? If you go back to this map, greater than 1,000. This pink, even though most of this is pink, is 10 to 300. So greater than 1,000 is 100 times more than that. And then out here is less than 10. And so that's 1,000 times more biomass than most of the ocean. Lots of biomass. So I mentioned it's zoned, largely resulting from things being either dry or facing wave pressure. So therefore, because of that, the more higher up you go, the more dry you are, more consistently dry, more shelled, mostly shelled organisms you're going to find. The lower you get, mostly soft-bodied organisms and algae because they're wet all the time. They don't need the protection quite as much. So if you zoom in and think about these different areas, the area up top is called the spray zone. It's always above the highest high tide. So it's basically always dry. And you see things like limpets and periwinkles. It can be water covered during storms, but it's generally dry. The animals that you find there are similar to terrestrial animals. Do you like how I walk on and off camera? So these look more like animals that you might expect to find in your backyard. Their goal is to avoid drying out because they obviously live near the ocean, so they like water, but they live in an area that is really close to the ocean but doesn't have a lot of water. And so there is also little algae, because algae like being wet more of the time. And that's called the spray zone. It's called the spray zone because when the waves crash, it sprays water up into the spray zone. The high tide zone is between the zones of highest high tide and lowest high tide, right? So the highest the water ever gets is the top of the high tide zone, and the lowest the high tide ever goes is the bottom. And in between is the high tide zone. And this is where you find things like barnacles and limpets as well. It's periodically exposed to air, but it's mostly dry, and so that's why there's some overlap with some of the animals you find up here and some of the animals you find down here, but not the animals you find down here. So these animals also need to avoid drying out, so they have shells. It includes marine algae and rock weeds with thick cell walls. Really fun stuff. Some examples from that high tide zone, things like barnacles are really common. Barnacles, if you ever go to the seashore, you see these, right, stuck to the rocks, and they're sticking their little faces out. They look like little tiny, tiny clams, and they filter seawater for food, so they're kind of filtering out things that are floating around in the water, like little particles and stuff. So this is the high tide zone. So we have the spray zone, it's the highest, and then the high tide zone. Below the high tide zone is the middle tide zone. The middle tide zone is exposed and submerged equally by tidal changes. What that means is that half the time it's above water, half the time it's below water. As a large diversity of organisms because of that, because half the time it's wet, half the time it's not, that gives you more niches, right, to live in. Highly competitive for hard bottom space. More types of marine algae, some soft-bodied animals in there, so you're starting to go from that transition from all hard to some soft, mostly soft. You find things like hermit crabs, sea stars, again, some more barnacles, mussels. Here's some different types of barnacles, goose barnacles, some sea stars eating a mussel. Those are the types of things you find in the middle tide zone. And this is where you see some creative innovations in terms of biology and how they find space and keep onto it. And so this is a picture of a mussel. You can see all of these stringy pieces sticking out of it. Basically, some mussels and some of the other animals, they have threads that attach to the rock or to algae, to other barnacles. And so when water comes in and beats them, right, because as we mentioned, one of the dividing features of the middle tide zone is that it's hit by high energy waves, and so half the time it's wet, half the time it's not. They can hold on really well. They're like, no way, I'm not going anywhere. I found this space. I stuck out my threads. I'm going nowhere. Right? And engineers, right? The kind of chemistry and physics of these threads is really interesting because they're super duper strong, right? And so this is the type of thing that people might be interested in finding out. How do they do that? How do they make those things? Why are they so strong? It keeps them, and they stay strong in dry conditions and wet conditions, right? Really interesting biomolecules. So it's also interesting ecology that this is an evolutionary adaptation that they have come up with that helps them keep the space once they find it. So in rocky intertidal zones, there's always kind of these areas that are hollowed out, where they look like, they're called tide pools. They look like pools. They're called tide pools, right? And so they're kind of on the tops of rocks usually, and they're wet. They can be formed during low tide, so it might be, a lot of times it'll be like somewhere that maybe is here, a little pocket that's here, that's submerged some of the time, but when low tide comes down, then you just have a pool, and the rest of the rock is out in the open. So many patches of water and depression. There's a lot of organisms that live in these pools, including things like anemones, which are permanently attached to the seafloor by a foot, and can sting prey and eat them. Excuse me. And 251ers, if you remember from the beginning of the chapter, what do these look like? Coral polyps, right? They look like coral polyps. Same family, same body design, right? Where, oops, dropped it. There's, it hit the wall and I dropped it. What's wrong with me? There's internal hollow gut, mostly, and then there's outside of the skin called the ectoderm, and the endoderm is the inside cell layer, and a bunch of tentacles, and nematocysts. So those are sea anemones. We also have a lot of hermit crabs here, which live in abandoned shells from snails. That they walk around and they're scavenging, and these are the types of things you find in tide pools. Tide pools are fun because they're these little isolated communities, and so in terms of ecology, you can learn a lot about animals that live, populations of animals that live in different tide pools that don't really communicate with each other because they're separated physically, but maybe the same species, and you could learn about things like genetic drift and speciation and evolution and all sorts of fun ecology questions. So this is classic ecology right here. So, and then when you get down all the way to the bottom, you have the low tide zone, which is mostly submerged except during the lowest low tide, right? So this is basically like wet seafloor most of the time. There's a lot of algae there. Many animals hidden by seaweed and seagrass. So there's a lot of animals in there you gotta try not to step on. This is where you have this over here. These are your sea anemones. You have some different types of sea stars. A lot of different species of animals and plants. You have urchins. They scrape algae with the bottom, with their mouth, which is on the bottom of their body. So they basically crawl along and eat stuff that's below them. And they grab with their feet between the spines. And this is, again, urchins are what are eating the kelp. Here's a picture of some brown algae with surf grass in low tide zone. So let's move from there. So those are rocky intertidal shores. Let's talk about sediment-covered shores. Sediment-covered shores includes coarse boulder beaches, sand beaches, salt marshes, mudflats, all these places where there's more sand or mud than there is rock. Energy level along the shore depends on wave strength, so sometimes it's pretty chill, sometimes it's not. Also longshore current strength. Remember we talked about longshore current? And fine-grained, flat-lying tidal, flat, more stable than high-energy sandy beach. That makes sense. Sorry, I had to think about that for a second. So basically saying, sand is actually not that fine-grained. Fine-grained will give you really nice mud. And that mud is pretty stable. Sandy beach, things move around a little bit. That's basically what we're getting at that. I think more important, these are the mud flats, salt marshes, sand beaches. These are the typical sediment-covered shores. And the thing that's interesting, so in the rocky intertidal community, they're really interesting because they're vertically zoned, right? And if we go back a few slides, they're vertically zoned epifauna, right? They're vertically zoned on top of the rocks. There are things like tide pools where they can kind of get in the rock, but they're not really like in the rock, right? They're in like bumps and divots. With sand, you could actually, in sediment, you could actually get into the sediment. And so they have in fauna. Animals that actually burrow, physically burrowing into the sand. There's no stable fixed surface. Burrowing provides more stable environment, less risk of temperature extremes and drying out. Examples of things you might find in sandy beaches are bivalve mollusks, which is basically clams and mussels, annelid worms, echinoderms, mostly small organisms that burrow. Biomass is about 200 grams per meter squared, if you remember. That is about 5 times smaller than the rocky intertidal biomass, right? And that's because this stuff, they're mostly smaller animals. So here's some picture of those in fauna. These are called myofauna, so they're not tiny, but they're in fauna because they're burrowing in the sand. And this is something called a nematode, which is a type of worm. Over here is 100 micrometers. So these are, maybe a millimeter, half a millimeter long, right? This thing's this is 1 millimeter right here. This is a few millimeters. This is an amphipod, this is a picture from your book, by the way, which is a crustacean related to shrimp and krill. And we have worms too, polychaete worms. These are segmented worms, shown with its mouth over here. And this is also maybe a millimeter. So these are things that you can see, but they're really small, and so not huge amounts of biomass. They feed on bacteria, includes polychaetes, it's this type of worm, nematodes, also a type of worm, mollusks and arthropods. Arthropods look like shrimp. And insects, right? Arthropods are basically insects. These are marine insects. They live in the sediment from the intertidal zone to the deep ocean trenches. So that's the cool thing about these. The animals that we talked about in the rocky intertidal zone, you only find them in the rocky intertidal zone for the most part. Some of the animals that you've down in the low tide zone you might find deeper in other parts of the ocean. Not any of the algae, but some of the other animals, because this is almost permanently submerged, so these are kind of normal marine animals. These things you find in sediments near shore and all the way down to sediments in ocean water that's 10,000 meters deep. So we mentioned as one of the types of sandy shores was mudflats. And this is basically wetlands where you have things like eelgrass and turtlegrass, bivalves and other mollusks, and fiddler crabs. I love fiddler crabs. Males have one small and one large claw, so when you see these fiddler crabs, right, you've seen these, right? If you've been to the beach, you've seen them. You may not have been to the beach, and that's okay, but if you have, you've probably seen them. They use their large claw to attract mates, and they make burrows. Remember we talked about in fauna, in sandy shores, being able to burrow. Their burrows can exceed a meter. So they go around, they're cute little different colors, and they use their huge hands to find mates. And then, guess what? I'm looking at my watch. It's only 24 minutes. We're back where we started. 250 wonders. That's what I wanted you to know about rocky seafloors. There's a lot more in the book. They're really interesting environments. There's, a lot of, especially the rocky intertidal communities, there's a lot of changes happening all the time in terms of tides coming in and going out and storms and things like that. So a lot of those animals are really interesting and resilient because they have to deal with a lot of different different, I guess, habitat. I can't think of the words. They have to deal with a lot of variability, and a lot of different kind of changes in the environment. So they have interesting adaptations for that. Your reward, 250 wonders for finishing early, is that you only have one chapter left. That's one of your rewards. And I'm going to show you the Galveston campus just a tiny bit. I don't know if you've ever been down here. So hopefully this isn't, that's not so bad. It's not too nauseating. If you haven't been down here, I should have done this during the day. It's kind of nice. Oh, you can't hardly see anything out there, and so that's really useless. And I'm sorry, but there's a field over there, and you're really just seeing the reflection of me in the window. So since that's so silly and lame, I guess I'll bring you back over here. And I will remind you, in this chapter, we've talked about hydrothermal vents, we've talked about coral reefs, we've talked about other kind of seafloor environments, and so that is what I expect you to know. For the exam, we have one chapter left. The last chapter is on climate change. I will be back in College Station to talk about that. It's been really fun. It's been really fun talking about the seafloor, and I'll see you in the next chapter, 251ers. Until then, be good people.